Welcome back, whiners, to our podcast of Wine About Data, giving you one less thing to whine about. My name is Amanda Lopez, president at Transform Consulting Group, and today I'm joined by my colleague, fellow Transformer, Rose Johnson. Rose, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Amanda. Rose Johnson, Senior Project Consultant at Transform Consulting Group, and I can bring a background in both direct service and youth development and fundraising, which I think is what we're talking about today. So
That's
I'm
right,
excited.
Rose. Yes, I'm so excited to have you join this podcast. And anybody who's had the opportunity to work with Rose loves Rose. She's a dynamic transformer on our team. But let's get to what we're talking about today, Rose, on the podcast. And so our last podcast episode, we talked about the latest report that came out from Giving USA, and really what are those key data insights that came out and how does that inform fundraising? So today we thought we would continue that conversation and build on how data is important and how you can use data to inform your fundraising strategy. So I'm really excited about the conversation and grateful that you're here today, Rose, because you also have a role of being a fundraiser. And so you lived this firsthand and know the value of that. But before we dig into the content of what we're talking about today, of course, we got to figure out, what are we drinking today, Rose?
Most importantly.
Yeah, so I'm excited. We have this really pretty bottle, right? And we're wearing blue today, so it kind of matches. Perfect. But it's called Elemental, and if you see, the AL means it's an aluminum bottle. So I'm not, I would like to say I'm a wine aficionado, but really not. I'm a, imposter here. But as we know, most wines come in a glass bottle. And so this company or this winery has figured it out to make bottles in aluminum cans.
This was a new one for me. And I have to say, over the summer, I love this because if you're going to the beach, you're going out, there's sand, you don't
to the pool,
glass. So this is perfect for those hot days.
Yep. And so I think the recyclability of it too, and for the environment is even better. Well, let's give it a taste. It's a Pinot Grigio, which is also a great summer wine, light, refreshing. So let's try it. Oh, it's good.
I love it.
I would have no idea that it was in aluminum
doesn't taste
can instead of a glass bottle.
It's really good.
I think they're onto something here. Yeah. So we picked it up at our local grocery store. So I think it's everywhere, but we will absolutely link this wine in the show notes. But we want you to join us regardless of what you're drinking in your cup today. So let's get back into the topic of our episode, which is, how are we using data to help inform and drive our fundraising strategy?
Yeah.
Well, I thought first, Rose, we should probably just define what is fundraising, because I think that word can mean so many different things to organizations. So let's first, how would you define fundraising?
Yeah, I suppose a textbook definition might be raising financial support for a cause, a charity, an enterprise of some kind. I like to think about fundraising as a process, right? It's, you're identifying individuals, organizations, funds that might have interest in supporting the cause that you're really passionate about. And then you're going through a process to understand them better, to see if you're the right fit. Yeah. And then you're inviting them to make an investment. And then most importantly, you're maintaining that relationship and continuing to grow it over time. So it's almost like dating in a way.
I love it. Yeah. But in this case, it's okay to have multiple dating partners, if you will.
In this case, yes, it's probably best.
But I think it does show that there is an investment here in relationship, and there's different forms of fundraising in types of data. So we're going to get into some of those details. But what are some of the pain points that you see in your experience and the clients that we've worked with at TCG and your prior experience that nonprofits struggle when it comes to fundraising?
Yeah, I think certainly one challenge that I've seen is just going after opportunities that aren't the right fit. I think that's really common. We're really wanting more support. We want those funds. And so we end up going after everything, which isn't usually the right strategy with limited time and resources. So I think that's one challenge. I also think there's a challenge around, sharing your story in a way that resonates with donors, right? Because we know we've got to tailor our story to our audience. And I know some organizations have some trouble doing that to make sure that it does resonate with donors. And then I think, following up can be a real challenge, honestly.
The follow through.
The follow through, because it, like I said, it's the time after that first gift
Yep.
that's the most important. And I think that whenever an organization gets in a position where the first time a donor hears from you again is with another request, that's never good.
Yeah.
So those are some pain points. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And one of the resources that we do both in a toolkit as well as a training is we talk about like what are the main primary sources of funding. So I loved that you brought that up, Rose, because a lot of times, you know, some people think, oh, I should go after grants, or I should go after sponsorships, or I should host a fundraising event. But when we really think about what are your goals, you know, what do you want to accomplish? How do you want to use this funding to support the mission? You know, that might not be the best funding source, you know, to do that. And so it's really about that intentionality. Well, of course, we're a podcast here talking about data. And so we know that data plays such a critical role to help inform your fundraising strategy and help you reach those fundraising goals. So let's talk about like, how does data support fundraising?
Yeah, you know, in a lot of ways, I will say, right? So just to kind of break down the first few that come to mind for me, I think certainly data can be a great tool for us in setting realistic but ambitious goals.
Yeah.
Right? We always want to set those fundraising goals so that we know about how much we can raise for the cause in a given year. And data can help to inform that process. It can really help us to build a realistic picture of what our opportunities are and how much we might expect to raise. And I think that really helps us be successful in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you could set out and say, you know, we need to raise $1 million, right? But then now, like, how are we going to get there? So what does those numbers actually mean? We're going to get, you know, $10,000 grants. So that's going to get us, or $10,000 gifts, individual gifts. That's 100,000. So really breaking it down.
Exactly. And I think that's good practice to get into as you're planning out your fundraising year in advance, having some of that forecasting and using your donor database to inform that.
Right. So just like we talk about with your programming and, you know, setting outcomes and outputs, the same process applies, right? We're going to want to set those SMART goals, which we've talked about before, right? For fundraising and breaking it down into really digestible, you know, buckets. And I think that makes it more attainable. I think a lot of leaders and board members are really intimidated about it. And some of those numbers do seem big, but then when we can break it down into those, you know, bite-sized, manageable goals, that really helps. And you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Rose, but I see data really playing a huge part in that storytelling.
Exactly.
And I know in one of our previous episodes that we'll link here, we talked about the importance of data storytelling and a process that nonprofits could use to help there. But when you're meeting with a donor or a potential funder, we definitely have to frame our story to what's important to them.
Exactly. And it varies. We know that, right? So one example I love is of, you know, a grant funding committee. You might have 10 folks on that committee. Some of them might really want the hard numbers. They're going to look at your budget. They're going to look at all of your outcome data really closely. You may have others where the stories are really going to resonate with them, the quotes, the testimonials. And so I think it's so vital to have both of those and be able to weave them together well to tell a compelling story for donors.
Yep, absolutely. You might be meeting with a business leader, and so they really want to know, like, what's that return on investment? And so having good outcome data or talking about maybe the economic impact, the return on investment, the financial value, that can be really important. You know, if you're going to somebody else who's really passionate about maybe the families you serve, right? You're going to want to share a different story. So really having your data in a way that can be framed and packaged differently, I think is really important. And we talk a lot about that in that data storytelling episode.
Exactly.
Any other ways that you think data is important and critical with fundraising?
I think data can help us a little bit more if an opportunity is a good potential fit.
Yes.
So I think in those first steps, when you're identifying potential prospects, whether they be individuals or foundations, corporate donors, any of the above, using the data that you have available to you to make decisions about what opportunities you pursue is really vital. And you have some great tools in front of you. You know, I think of Foundation Center as a great opportunity for researching our foundations. Donor Search Search is a great tool for understanding individual donors and what their interests might be. And so I think it's really important to do our homework and use data to inform those decisions.
Yep, absolutely. And we'll make sure to link all those resources in our show notes. So those are great resources. I also, when we are working with a client and we're looking at their funding data to kind of audit what does their funding look like, and we will ask for a list of their donors, their corporations, individuals, companies who've been supporting them, really to mine your data, right?
Yeah.
And I think, instead of just looking at the top level, how do we study that, and thinking about, I think there's so many different things that you should be looking at with your individual giving data and your corporate data, but, how many times are people giving? Are they giving consistently?
Yeah.
Is somebody giving consistently? What are the kind of cut levels of giving? You have a lot in the maybe $100 or less, or $1,000 or less, or what are some of those giving trends? Who's falling off, right? Who is giving?
That's huge. Yeah.
And we need to kind of get back into that cultivation.
Absolutely. Donor retention, I think that's an incredibly important number that a lot of organizations miss. But to what extent are you keeping donors year after year? That's a really important measure of success overall.
Right. And then, I think we're seeing a lot of trends too with volunteers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so looking at, how maybe you can move some of your volunteers into that donor, platform, and also maybe your donors. How are they coming and attending events and engaging?
Yeah. And I think that's even an advanced, if you're an organization with an
established
fundraising program, going a step further and starting to connect your data, connect your systems, your donor system to your volunteer system, to your membership system, making those things talk to each other and seeing where you have the same folks overlapping is a really great strategy.
Yeah. I definitely agree. That's probably next level. So if you're looking at how to level up, but we do recommend, if you have a CRM type of a system or a donor software system, that we're definitely using it. I think that's what we see is a lot of times we're not really using it and studying it to the fullest of our ability.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a big pitfall in this work in general is, to analyze and understand your donor data well, it first has to be reliable and it has to be complete, right? So we have to feel good about the information that's in there before we can really use it well.
Right. And just like what we say with our program data, the more you're in there, auditing it, using it, the more you're going to use it and the better and cleaner that data is going to be.
Exactly.
Okay, well, hopefully we made a strong enough case that if you're not looking at some data, that you start doing that to help inform your fundraising strategy. So let's talk now about solutions. So we always want to leave our listeners with some tips and helpful ideas that you can immediately apply that help improve and get you closer to your outcome. So Rose, what are some suggestions that we have?
Yeah. So, my first suggestion to start with is kind of what you just said, audit your data, right? Sit down, ideally with your team, anybody who's involved in fundraising, and really dig into your data and check it. See how complete it is, see how accurate and up to date it is, and be critical, right? So that audit process can be daunting, especially if we have a big database. I would say, to make that less daunting, consider segmenting your donors and starting with your largest donors or your most recent donors, and then moving from there. But the more you feel secure about your data, the more you can use it to make decisions.
Yep, absolutely. And this could also be a good opportunity to get your board involved, either your executive committee or if you have a development committee. So certainly the staff would, carry that heavy load. But once you have some of that auditing of data, then sharing it with the board and talking about how does this inform our fundraising plan, our budget, our goals, and where we want to go. And also, hopefully your board has some good connections and relationships, that you can help cultivate some of these donors or opportunities that we identify there. So that's usually the first step that we do when we're doing a fund development project is we start with I like to say we're going to look under the hood.
Absolutely.
Whatever the data is, wherever it lives, you don't need a fancy software, but we want to kind of do that audit to kind of take a look at those trends. And I would say too, don't just look at the last year. We want to have 5 years would be great.
5 years is better. Yeah.
Especially, we're post-COVID now, 5 years.
Yeah.
So, what has happened, certainly those early years of COVID, that was a unique time. So you want to have a little bit of a good trend there. So you might look pre-COVID, see if you're back to what things were. Some donors fell off there.
Yeah. And I think as you're looking at your data, those are some really critical numbers to look at is, like I said, donor retention. So to what extent are you keeping donors year after year, but also lapsed donors. So donors who gave last year, but not this year. those are really great opportunities to reconnect. And, you may miss folks in that boat if you're not looking at your data.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what are some other tips that we have for how data can help our fundraisers out there who are in this role?
Yeah. So I think another tip that I would definitely point out is using your data to ensure that you're following up well with your donors. So using your database to track follow-ups, to track your touches, and having those recorded somewhere. So how often are we reaching out to this donor, either through a phone call, email, a meeting, having all those things tracked lets you understand how that relationship is growing.
Right.
And having notes from those interactions helps to inform your asks down the way and how that relationship develops over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really, as an organization, you can identify what are those key steps that we want to have in the process, right?
Exactly.
So, donors maybe at this level, they're going to get a mailed thank you letter, or they're going to get a summary of whatever their donations supported at the organization, right? Maybe donors at a higher level, they're going to get a phone call, maybe a touch point. But what are those steps along the way that your organization is going to commit to?
Exactly.
Post a giving and post gift, and then having a method that you can process and track so that there's good accountability to check off.
Exactly.
And I find, I'm sure, Rose, you would agree that through this continued nurturing, you're going to see those donors invest more.
Absolutely. That stewardship process, it is a lot easier to retain a donor than it is to get a new donor. And so investments that you make in stewardship and cultivating that relationship over time are so worth it. Right. And so that is where I would start first in really investing in your current donor base.
Yep. So some nonprofits listening are like, man, I got some work to do.
And that's okay.
And I know our listeners are at a continuum, right? We have some maybe who have a dedicated staff or a department, that is supporting fundraising and development, that have the bells and whistles with software, to some who don't. It's the executive director who's wearing multiple hats. They're working off of a spreadsheet, maybe not even a spreadsheet, right? So what are some tips of how individuals, how nonprofits could get started?
Yeah, so I would say, I think we already touched on auditing your data, which can be a process that you do over time, right? It doesn't all have to happen at once, but I think that's a good initial step. Then I would also say, a good tip is kind of what we mentioned around segmenting your donors. If you have a huge donor database and you just don't have time to, update and track all of those records, start smaller and start with just maybe your top 10% of donors and look at their records and dig into those and track your stewardship for those folks and then grow from there. I think that makes it a little more approachable.
Yeah, I love that because I know it can be overwhelming. And in fact, one of the boards that I sit on, our local Main Street nonprofit, it's a small nonprofit. We have 2.5 full-time staff, right? And so we haven't, and we're just transitioning into becoming more of a fundraising organization. It was a membership-based organization. And so now we've worked off of spreadsheets. The organization also has gone through leadership changes. So each executive director had a different spreadsheet. So you can imagine, right? It's messy. And so we finally decided we'd make the commitment, the investment of purchasing a donor software out there. And there's certainly a lot out there, but we found one that we felt is the right size for where we're at. But that just takes time now to go through and auditing the data to clean it up. And so we are removing it in chunks to get there.
It's a worthwhile investment, though. If you don't have a donor database system, it's worth looking into because I think it really helps you to use your data more easily than a spreadsheet or another method.
Yeah. And if you're advising somebody like one of our clients, what would be some key data points that you would say, these are important data points? I know we've kind of talked about a lot of ones in general, but let's get specific with our listeners.
Yeah. So I would definitely look at your donor retention rate. So that's the percentage of donors who gave last year who have given again this year. That's a really critical number to see particularly how successful your stewardship is. I would certainly look at your average gift and then kind of segment that out. So historically, what are your larger gifts looking like? What size gifts are those? And then, what are some of your smaller gifts? You understand that range and what the average is. And then, I do think lapsed donors are an important thing. If you don't look at anything else in your donor database, I think it's important to have a list of lapsed donors. LIBUNTS, last year but not this year,
Yeah.
is a fun acronym. But donors who, you know, have maybe fallen off your radar. I think that your donor database can be a really good check to make sure that you're not missing anybody and that you are maintaining those relationships.
Yeah, I love that. One other data point, and I know we talked about it at the beginning, but also what's your funding mix?
Absolutely. Yeah. What percentage of funds are coming from individuals versus foundations versus corporate gifts, events?
Yep.
Understanding where your dollars are coming from can help you to be more strategic about which opportunities you pursue to make sure it's diversified.
Right.
Yeah.
And like we talked about, you can use that Giving USA Sum report to benchmark how is your organization doing against other nonprofits and seeing opportunities where you might grow, as well as how it aligns to support your strategic plan goals. Well, Rose, I know we could talk about this forever. So this was just the beginning. I foresee lots of segments here of episodes to go deeper into how data can help inform the nonprofit's fundraising goals. So let's do a wine recap.
Yeah.
Because we data dumped on you all today, a lot of information and tips. So what's one tip that we want to leave our listeners that we'd hope that if they could do one thing today to help use data to support their fundraising, what would you suggest?
I would suggest that you figure out where your data is living and that you start the process of auditing it.
Yes.
And checking if it's accurate. I think that's step one, and that you bring in help if you have it. Bring in your team and start small. Segment your donors, start with a smaller group, but start that process.
That's so great. Yep. So just start with what you have.
Exactly.
And use that and study it and get deeper with it. Those are all great tips, Rose. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We will link all of these resources that we shared in our show notes, and we have a lot of other blogs and resources on our website. So if you aren't yet following Transform Consulting Group on our social media, or you haven't signed up for a newsletter, I would encourage you to do that, because that's where you're going to get all the latest and greatest updates of new reports that come out that we find helpful and important, as well as new blogs and articles that we're writing to support our nonprofit clients out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet to our podcast, we definitely encourage you to do that in whatever podcast you choose to listen, so you can get the latest episode. We are so thankful that you guys are all here, and let's cheers to our nonprofits who are doing a great job to transform the world. Cheers to you, Rose.
Cheers.
Thanks.